morning and welcome. My name is Paul Wilkinson from Longevity Leaders. I'm just here to give you a brief introduction and some housekeeping notes before we hand over to our two hosts for this roundtable discussion, focused on the positive response to climate change. Our impact host today is Richard Zugic from the Phoenix Group. Our trend host is Professor Paul Wilkinson from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So hopefully we'll have some people joining us today. And anyone who does join us, please make sure your display name appears at the bottom of your screen, so we know who you are. And just a reminder to everyone, this session is being recorded and will be available on the event platform a little later this afternoon. Aside from our hosts, just letting someone into the meeting. Aside from our hosts, participants are asked to keep their microphones on mute, and then participants are asked to use the raise the hand button to speak and to be invited to contribute to the discussions. Alternatively, questions can be asked via the private chat function, and I can forward that to our two hosts. So just to get things going, I will hand over to Richard from the Phoenix Group, who will guide you through this morning's session. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable where over the next hour we're going to be exploring some of the potential positive impacts of climate change on longevity. Just to set the scene a little bit, we're going to kick off with some introductions, get to know each other a little bit. After that, our trend host, Professor Paul Wilkinson, will give us a presentation. He'll walk us through a number of slides to get our mental faculties flowing on this topic, and that will lead nicely into a 30 minutes or so discussion where everyone will be invited to participate, ask questions and contribute to the roundtable conversation, and then we'll conclude with a wrap up at the end. So that's the order of events. I'll kick off with a brief introduction of myself before handing over to Paul. So my name is Richard Zugic, and I head up the Group Actuarial function for the Phoenix Group. And for those that aren't that familiar with the Phoenix Group, we're a UK life insurer. We're a consolidator of life businesses. And as a group, we now have over 10 million UK customers, over 1 million of which have an annuity with us. So longevity risk is the largest risk on our balance sheet. It's one that's dear to me and important for us to be able to manage as a group. As a group, we hold over £1 billion of capital against adverse outcomes in future longevity. So we're heavily invested in it, and it's important to us, as it will be to many institutions across the country, both in the private sector, I guess, and for the state and individuals as well. So we've got an exciting conversation today around climate change. I'm going to hand over now to Paul Wilkinson, who will introduce himself and take us through a few slides.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen, except for I can't. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Can somebody enable it for me, please?
1 second, Paul. Let me. I will make you the host.
While we're doing that, a little bit of kit, Paul, I see we've got Victoria Sander on this panel. I was just wondering, Victoria, could you just unmute yourself and briefly introduce yourself so we can orient ourselves to you?
Hi, yes, so I'm Victoria Sander. I head up the insurance group at Latham & Watkins, and I have been working in the industry on de-risking transactions for many years, including bulk annuities and longevity hedging transactions, both for pension schemes and also for insurers. doing sort of longevity reinsurance. My interest in the sector also spans a wide range of topics, and ESG and climate change have been very heavily on the forefront of what boards and other financial investors are considering at the moment. So for insurers, obviously, it affects both the risk side of the business and also the asset side of the business. So interested to hear from the panel on that perspective.
Fantastic, Victoria. Thank you. Over to you, Paul. I see the slides are up. Maybe just a brief introduction from yourself as well.
Sure, good. Well, welcome from me as well. My name is Paul Wilkinson. I'm a professor of environmental epidemiology based at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I also direct the National Institute for Health Research, Health Protection Research Unit on environmental change, which is largely focused on climate change. And I'm involved in a variety of other research fields and projects funded by, among others, the Wellcome Trust, including one on complex urban systems for sustainability in health, in which we try to understand all the connections between climate change and health and our responses to it. And it's from that I'm going to draw on over the next few slides. So very broadly, as I'm sure you're all aware, the connection between climate change and health can be broadly categorized into two headings. The first is to do with the direct and indirect effects of climate change on health itself. So heat waves, floods, storms, people are adversely affected by them. And I'll say a little bit about some of the numbers relating to those in a moment. But note that some of the larger impacts, certainly in global terms, and maybe eventually even for the UK, maybe through rather indirect routes on things like food and crop production, spread of vector-borne disease, and so on. So these aren't things which we currently have adverse effects, but they may become so in the future. Those are all essentially the harms, because most of those effects of climate change are harmful, though not entirely, but we are going to learn to protect ourselves against those and may diminish some of the adverse consequences for health. But there is a second category, which I've there labeled ancillary effects of climate change mitigation. And in many ways, this is the sort of action that's going to have a much more profound effect on population health, because it entails all the things of the low carbon transition, which not universally, but largely have positive effects to improve population health, because it'll help reduce harmful exposures such as air pollution, and hopefully also promote other healthier behaviors as a part of the response to climate change, which may include things like active travel, more walking and cycling, and improved diets. And I'll just say a little bit about each of those areas as we go through. So first of all, just in terms of thinking about one of the main sources, at least of mortality in the UK, is temperature. And actually, the relationship between temperature and mortality risk is extremely well known, and we can characterize it pretty precisely. And here is one of those curves for London, and it shows plotted on the y-axis is the relative risk of mortality, meaning how many times you multiply the baseline rate in relation to what's on the x-axis, which is temperature. So you can see that the minimum temperature occurs at an outdoor daily maximum of around 19 Celsius. And if you go to temperatures to the right of that, the red curve indicating the heat effect, you see that there is a steep rise in mortality. So you're then beginning to multiply your risk of dying. If you go to the left of it, there is a very slow initially increase in risk, and it's colored blue here to indicate a cold effect. And until you get down to below about 5 degrees Celsius maximum daytime temperature, then there's a sudden increase in risk, meaning that the colder you get, the greater the risk becomes. And we are pretty sure that these are cause and effect. these data, this curve is based on time series analysis, which essentially relates to the number of people dying day by day in relation to temperature, the same, temperature measured on the same day, and adjusted for all the other things that may vary over time. I won't go into all the details of what that is. It actually is quite a tricky statistical process, but the attribution is pretty clear. And this is how we know how many heat deaths there are and cold deaths. And there are a number of things to say from it. The first is that very clearly it's a U-shaped relationship, so they're both heat and cold. It turns out that more people die from moderate heat and moderate cold than they do from extreme heat or extreme cold. And that's simply because there are many more days of moderate heat when the risks are lower relatively to extreme heat, of course, but there are just a lot more days of moderate heat than there are of extreme heat. So if you add, if you multiply the risk by the frequency of those days, you end up with more people dying on days of moderate heat or moderate cold than there are extreme heat and extreme cold. But the second thing is that actually in the UK perspective at the moment, there are far more cold deaths than there are heat deaths. Under climate change, everyone worries about heat because we see the heat waves occurring, they're very visible. The effects in 2003 were quite transparent to everybody and so on. But actually, the balance of numbers is dominantly in favor of cold, not only in the UK, but in almost every country where the temperature effect has been analysed. So as a rule of thumb, it's about a tenfold difference. There are about 2,000 heat-related deaths a year in the UK at the moment. Of that order, there are about 20,000 cold-related deaths per year at the moment. And of course, as we warm, we're going to increase the risk of heat deaths, but we may well reduce the risk of cold deaths. And because there are more of them, the balance may be that overall there are some subtle changes in the cold and heat balance. And there are a number of things we are doing as well that I'm not going to talk in detail about it, but one of the key interventions that the government is needing to make and that we as householders will need to do is to improve the energy efficiency of our homes. And we believe that that has a very important modifying risk on cold-related death in particular, so that as we improve housing quality, in part to deal with mitigation questions, we will also help to reduce some of these cold-related burdens. And if you take a very long strategic view over the last century or so, the burden of coal-related death has come down bit by bit by bit every decade, getting smaller and smaller. And that, I think, reflects the general improvement that we have, not only in housing, but also all sorts of other factors. So there are some important trends there. And I think actually the cold mortality burden will reduce, but there is certainly probability that there will be increase in heat deaths. And as you can see, the way the curve looks at the moment, if you can imagine shifting the temperature distribution upwards, we may go into a fairly steeply rising part of that risk curve. So that I think there are likely to be some fairly large impact events, very visible events, heat waves and so on in the future, as there were in 2003. Now, that's sort of about the direct effects and maybe some of the modifying influences we have on it by housing initiatives. But I wanted to talk a bit about a couple of other areas which will be the focus of work for mitigation action. So to deal with climate change, mitigation meaning we're reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. There are various things which we can do for that. And broadly, we have to take action in every sector of the economy. Now, one sector where there is quite a big influence, quite a big contribution towards greenhouse gas emissions is in the food and agriculture sector. And it turns out that actually there are big differences between food types in their carbon footprint or the carbon equivalent, because a lot of it's not actually carbon, but methane, which is produced from particularly the meat and dairy industries. And by adjusting our dietary patterns, we would be able to make quite a big contribution towards cutting the emissions from the food and agriculture sector. And obviously that depends on a behavior change. And there are uncertainties on how much that behavior change can be guided. But in the past, we have successfully helped to maneuver people's taste somewhat and to get them used to different ways of eating. And I think it's very likely that we will succeed in doing some element of that in the future, as is needed for climate change. But the important thing to realize is that the foods that have a low carbon footprint tend to be ones that would also good for health. And it turns out that actually, if you had a diet, not the current UK diet, but one which was just met the World Health Organization principles of a healthy diet, that would already have a 17% lower emission of greenhouse gas emissions than our current food supply does. So just by switching to a healthy diet, we'd have a 70% benefit for climate change mitigation. Or if you turn it around, if we were trying to pursue climate change mitigation, there would be a health benefit. And what I've done on this slide is showed some results from some work which we did a few years ago, modeling and looking at the dietary patterns in the UK and how they relate to greenhouse gas reduction. And I can't go into the detail of it, but what you see here on the x-axis are different levels of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it starts at 17%, which is the kind of the baseline assumed WHO diet, and that already is a 17% reduction, as I mentioned, compared to the current UK. But as you go further to the right, in saving more greenhouse gas emissions from the diet, that means that we are manipulating the choice of foods that people would consume somewhat. They aren't necessarily dramatic changes, but there would be some reductions in meat and dairy, and broadly substitutions with things like fruit, vegetables, pulses, and some other subtle changes. Now, it turns out that up to about 30% saving of greenhouse gas emissions is a relatively modest change in dietary pattern, quite palatable. Beyond that, it starts to get quite tricky. And when you're getting down to 50, 60%, that's kind of like having lentils for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's not palatable. But as you see for all of these, the blue curve at the top is the total saving, and the different causes of death are shown by the other lines. So the second one down is coronary heart disease. And this is just the cumulative reduction in years of life lost over a 30-year period that you would get by a shift in diet towards these amounts of savings. So there will be an impact on population health and almost certainly on life expectancy if we are able to achieve some of these reductions, some of these improvements, shifts in dietary pattern needed to support the greenhouse gas emissions reduction. How much we can achieve, of course, is still an open question. I think we're going to need to do, an important step along this route. How far we go to the right is, remains to be seen. But there is an important health effect as well as a greenhouse gas reduction from this sort of process.
Sorry to interrupt. Could I ask a question at this point about that? In talking about the change to dietary foods that will help reduce greenhouse gases. Yeah. Obviously, one of the issues is where that food is coming from. So, yes. in your modelling, am I assuming that you've assumed that where people are moving to fruit and vegetables, those are locally sourced, or what? Because that's yes. Well, I mean, it's a relevant point. I don't think we assumed everything is locally sourced necessarily. I think we. I have to say I can't remember the exact details of what we assumed, but it was based on the sources and the footprints of foods as we consume them at the moment. So we didn't assume we had to change anything. It's just if we switch from some foodstuffs to other foodstuffs, given the same sources as we currently use in the UK, this would be the effect. There may be additional savings if we were to switch more towards seasonal foods, locally produced and so on. That may also reduce the impact of the same foods or of the foods we consume separately. So that isn't what this is implying. This is simply shifting the balance or the components of our diet from some areas to others. So broadly reducing, the main ones would be reducing red meat and dairy production and boosting other areas like fruit, vegetables, pulses and things using their current sources. So we don't have to invoke. That could be an alternative, that would be an additional way of making savings from the agriculture sector, as indeed can technology be. So there are ways of producing so that you can lower the emissions from the land, from cows and ruminants and so on. So there are technological things you can do as well, and that's not recorded here. This is just simply the dietary pattern based on current
sources of foods and using the footprint, therefore, as they are estimated for the UK. But if you want the chapter and verse, I'll have to go back. I can't even remember. I need to go back to our original paper to look at exactly what sources of evidence we use for it. Is that reasonably clear?
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So a second area is in relation to, well, particularly transport. Now, actually, this isn't a transport. This is a leisure time, physical activity relationship. But one of the main areas, of course, that we'll need to pay attention to is the transport sector. It's a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and indeed to ambient air pollution. Now, we aren't assuming that all journeys or even a lot of journeys can be substituted by more active travel, but it is almost certainly going to become an increasing part of the promotion from government and from health agencies to encourage shorter journeys, more of them to be done through walking and cycling. And that may well happen in the short term now because of the COVID-19 experience where people are reluctant to go on to public transport. Now, the degree to which this is achieved will also carry health benefits. And this is a meta-analysis of some data looking at, in this case, leisure time, moderate to vigorous physical activity, but very similar if you look at other types of physical activity. And what you see is on the x-axis are these metabolic equivalent tasks. Essentially, these are intensity of work rate. I think a moderately vigorous physical activity would include going for a reasonably brisk walk, something of that kind, going for a walk with your dog. And if you can do more of this, so that would include building into, for example, commuting patterns, people who cycle to work or walk more of their journey to work, you can reduce the mortality risk from following this function. Now, of course, it depends where you start, because if you're already physically active, as it were, you may be starting down here, and so there's a relatively, actually, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but if you're starting far down the curve, by increasing physical activity, you may not reduce risk much. But if you start from a very sedentary base at the very far left, any increase in physical activity would be a big reduction in risk. And I think it's very likely that there will be a gradual and progressive increase in people doing more physical activity, more active travel for their work, and maybe for leisure activity too, for all sorts of reasons, as part of the solutions for the transport network. And although it may not be everywhere, I think that the levels will go up from what is at the moment quite a low baseline. I'm not sure quite what the upper limit is. The best country in the world on this is Copenhagen, where they reckon half of all journeys, commuting journeys to work, are now done by cycling. We are far off that. We are down into single figures percents, even in the most active areas. But there will be a shift on that. And because physical activity is such an important part of determinant of risk, cardiovascular disease and others, that it will also have an impact on life expectancy as well, again, depending on the degree of change. And the last one I really wanted to make much comment on was about air pollution. Of course, the low carbon transition very obviously means we are going to burn less fossil fuels. So less coal, less oil, less gas. And we know, again, the risk of those fairly well. The Committee on the Medical Effects of Air Pollutants, I'm a member of that committee. A few years ago, well, actually nearly a decade now, published 2010, I think, did an assessment of the mortality impacts of fine particles. PM 2.5 means particles smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. And we pick those out because they're the fine particles that can be breathed in deep into the lungs. They're likely to become, a high fraction of them may be combustion related. And so they relate to a lot of the activities, anthropogenic activities, our own human activities that contribute to particle loads in the atmosphere. Now, the assessment that COMIAP did a few years ago was that if you were able, in some thought experiment, to reduce or remove all anthropogenic emissions, you would save around 340,000 life years each year. And the equivalent, taken from a whole life perspective, is reversing a loss from birth of life expectancy of about 6 months, 5 to 6 months. In other words, the fact that we all grow up now in an atmosphere with today's air pollution means on average we all die about 5 or 6 months earlier than we would if we lived in a world without that air pollution. Now, you can't remove all of that anthropogenic emissions because it's very difficult to remove some. I mean, even if you had, for example, electric cars, which have zero toxic emissions from the tailpipe, there are still substantial particle emissions from tire and brake wear. In fact, it's now reckoned that about half, may even be more than half, of the particle emissions from transport is not related to the combustion engine at all, but from tire wear, brake wear, road surface, and so on. But air pollution clearly is going to be affected by our energy sources, by our transport systems, even by agriculture, by everything that we do, and that will also improve. And just to tell you, so average loss of life expectancy from birth of 6 months means that I'm losing about a minute of my life for contributing to this session, and so are you by listening to it. So well done for your commitment. Now, this slide summarizes this is very broad brush stuff. This is roughly what I think we might expect gains to be. So I've put 4 categories here: air pollution, housing, dietary change, and active travel. There are some other minor ones. But these are the big ones, I think, in terms of action. So air pollution is really energy systems. I think if we went to achieve that full change, that would save us about 3 months of life expectancy in total. So not the full 5 or 6 months, because we can't replace everything. It's not all combustion related. So maybe around 3 months life expectancy for the average person. Housing is very difficult because it depends on the balance. There are very positive effects, but also some dangers that you can increase indoor risks if you make homes less well ventilated. It should be positive. It's likely to be of the order of a few months, but it's very hard to be precise at the moment. And it is possible in some circumstances it could become negative if we get overzealous on our ventilation characteristics. So I've put a question mark there, but the probability is it will be a gain of probably of the order of a few months. Now, dietary change and active travel both depend on the degree of behavior change. And, you know, if the whole population took that up in a lot, we could save several years per person. I'm guessing that with a feasible degree of uptake, that we might get somewhere of the order, roughly, a year benefit if there is some reasonable upscaling of all of those. But just to put that in context, you'll know these sorts of statistics. This is Office for National Statistics, the change in life expectancy over the last few decades. And, you know, it's been rising generally for all sorts of reasons, changes in healthcare, public health, but also improvements in diet and things. But that's been leveling off. But you can see that over that time, we've had gains of, you know, half a decade at least or more. This might be adding appreciably to those figures, but there are other adverse trends, which is partly accounting for some of this leveling off now, adverse effects of rising obesity, less physical activity, and so on, which all of this is having to fight against. So in summary, I think if the climate change responses is likely to lead to quite a few things that would be positive for health. Not all, there are some negatives, and we might expect a modest to moderate improvement in life expectancy as a result of those. And some of those are almost certain to come about because, you know, the improvement in air quality will almost certainly happen in large measure because that's the nature of what the low carbon transition will achieve and is necessary. The behavioral ones are a bit harder to guess at, and that's my contact if you have any questions afterwards in which to email me. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Paul, thank you so much for that presentation. Plenty of food for thought there, lots of interesting materials. Victoria, we've got a fairly intimate setting here, so you should feel welcome to jump in with questions as and when. But if I may, I'm just going to kick off with something to get the discussion rolling. Paul, how quickly do you think we might be able to achieve some of these gains? And are the impacts going to be distributed differently for different cohorts of lives, different socioeconomic groups? And finally, a third one to that, are these impacts going to vary a great deal depending on how the rest of the world responds to the climate change challenge? I.e., if the globe meets UK targets for reductions at one bookend, or if the rest of the planet pretty much goes on as we are, is that going to have an impact on UK in different ways?
Well, let me take that last point first of all. Nothing that I have said in the presentation here really makes much reference to future climate change impacts on health, because the mitigation effects are really independent of that. They are the things which we gain in the shorter term as a consequence of action. So, you know, getting rid of fossil fuels is going to be a near-term benefit for health, or begin in the near term, whatever we collectively succeed in doing for climate change. This isn't reducing the climate change effect. If we are able to do that, that would be another gain. But that is, you know, that is somewhat distant. It's uncertain. It depends on the collective action of all the other countries and so on. So the way I talk about, and I think most of my colleagues in this field talk about these mitigation effects, is based purely on the rationale of what we may get now, as it were, or now and in the years to come. The schedule of it is, there are two delays in it, I suppose. The first is the delay of the implementation of the actions. You know, how fast do we decarbonize? How fast do we change our transport infrastructure, and so on? And that, you know, that varies. But the other part is that there are some delays, inherent lags in the consequences for health. Now, in terms of the implementation, first of all, of course, I mean, you all realize that we're on a trajectory of change all the time. And in some areas, we've been making very good progress. So actually, our power generation, electricity, is doing very well. We're pretty much on target. We are decarbonizing very rapidly. Just recently, renewables overtook fossil fuels for generation on some periods. And we've had days when there's been no coal-fired power stations. Coal is particularly polluting both climate change and toxic agents for health. So that's good that we are moving away from coal. So that is happening all the time. And we can't really see it, but you know, year by year, those are incrementally helping to improve air quality. But it is very much incremental, and we have hiccups on the way. You know, diesel cars was a bit of a unfortunate detour for all sorts of reasons. Yeah, and some of those things may not necessarily help air quality, but we are improving it gradually, and that will just simply continue. And I think, you know, all of the measures now seem to be that a lot of people have the ambition now. You know, we've got the net zero world by 2050. We have the Mayor of London setting a net zero for London, even ahead of that perhaps. Big ambitions, and I think they will start to gain pace. So, you know, there will be changes in transport infrastructure. There will be changes in all major sectors, and I think it will gradually unwind. So I think those air pollution ones will come in, but it will be bit by bit. You know, each year there'll be a few more percent, and it'll gradually improve things. But it won't be eliminated, as I say, because a lot of the pollutants that we generate are not just from burning things. And there are some very complicated relationships. I've mentioned already the emissions that come from, you know, vehicle movements, the brakes, the tires, the road surface, which you won't get rid of, and that is a source of particle pollution. But surprisingly, agriculture is a big contributor as well, and that partly depends on land use, on fertilizers, ammonia emissions, and so on, get into the atmosphere, turn into ammonium, and it combines with other agents, so you get ammonium nitrates and other salts, and those are fine particles as well. So it's complicated in all areas, but you know, I think all sections we're on a trajectory of change, and some are already on track, which is the energy generation, but all the others, I think the UK Climate Change Committee realised we're behind the curve. We need to accelerate action, and I think we will. I mean, if we are to meet the ambitions, and there are many bodies now who are determined that we should do so, there will be increasing pace on those. Now, the health effects, there are lags, because even if we turned off air pollution today, you don't get all that immediate benefit today. Some things are short-lived. Some things aren't are effectively irreversible, because, you know, it's a bit like with smokers, that if you smoke for 50 years and the fact you stop, you don't immediately reverse all the risk for your life. But broadly, I think there is a sort of, within a few years, you're probably halving the risk from air pollution, you know, even the long-term buildup. And probably you're getting rid of most of it over the course of, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years. So as we reduce, there is a sort of a lag effect also in the health impacts, but you would get a large part of that benefit quite rapidly. You'll get some within days or weeks, but you'll get most of it probably within, you know, a few years, less than a decade, will achieve most of it. So it's all a bit of a long-term cohort effect. You won't be able to reverse everything, but, you know, these are population-wide exposures. So the advantage is small changes means that everybody's exposed and everybody benefits, therefore, if things are reduced. In terms of who benefits and are there inequalities and things, those are very interesting questions, because well, to some extent, things like air pollution, you know, those are population-wide, so they benefit everybody. But it turns out that for probably obvious reasons, poorer populations, more deprived, tend also to be ones where they are more highly exposed. They're also probably more vulnerable. They have higher underlying disease rates. So even if you've got the same multiplying effect of air pollution, if the underlying rates are higher, so is the, you know, the attributable bit from the air pollution exposure. And I think because air pollution will be it's a universal, ubiquitous environmental change, then we can expect that that will actually be probably beneficial in reducing health inequalities from that component. But of course, air pollution is only one small part of health inequalities. The other things are more complicated, because actually the people who are more likely to respond, I mean, there's reasonable evidence that, you know, the people who are going to cycle more and eat healthier diets and so on are more likely to be middle class. And so even though everybody has the same potential and the same opportunity to benefit, poorer populations probably won't. And in part, that is because of resources. They can't afford to buy the same food choices and so on. And there may be all sorts of social and behavioral pressures. You know, you probably wouldn't cycle if you lived on a very rough housing estate where your bicycle is going to get stolen and so on. So these are complicated things. I'm not sure that we should let them stop us from what are going to be very important population level initiatives about improving travel patterns and so on. But exactly how that will impact on inequalities and who's benefiting and so on is complicated. Some things will probably help to narrow inequalities, but there are also things we need to guard against, and some which are probably even adverse incentives or adverse impacts. So for things like, you know, if you're generating electricity by more renewable means, that the investment in that probably is adding a cost to power generation and therefore the cost of electricity. And unless there are subsidies or mechanisms to protect those who are less able to afford it, that obviously can have an adverse effect on household incomes and the health consequences that follow from it. Have I answered all the questions that you asked? I can't remember. What else do you want me to comment on?
No, I think that was very comprehensive, Paul. Very, very, very helpful. I'm going to pause here and just invite Victoria to contribute if she would like to pose a question at this stage.
Thanks very much, Richard. I mean, it's a fascinating area, and I think what I'm getting from this is that if you pull a lever in one place, it can have a positive effect, but there might be sort of other downsides elsewhere that one needs to sort of think across the piece. I did just want to invite some comment on COVID-19, because I think there is no panel discussion going on at the moment where that doesn't come onto the horizon. I think there were a couple of things that occurred to me. One on the journeys to work and the idea of sort of substituting sort of healthier journeys for sort of more polluting sort of transport means. that I can see in your slides has a positive effect on health. But I do wonder about longer term trends now that sort of many people have discovered that they can work as effectively from home, that actually those journeys may not happen, but instead of people taking healthier exercise options, actually what they do is go up the stairs and sit at their desk and do no exercise, which sadly has sort of slightly been the story of my lockdown. I don't even walk to the station anymore either, and then from the station at the other end into the office. So I wondered whether you thought that this might show some longer term trends on how people are working, remote working, moving around, and actually how that sort of might be one of those levers in the opposite direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right, aren't of course, that COVID-19 is going to have all sorts of implications. We've been discovering things about the way we can operate and the things we want to do, don't want to do, in a much more dramatic way than we might have liked. But it has brought home all sorts of lessons. And I think there are, again, a lot of things to comment on. I mean, the first in relation to travel is that for where people are going to travel, I'm sure there are going to be shifts in the short term. People are going to be much less keen to travel on public transport because of risk of transmission in confined carriages, particularly when they're overcrowded. And if you look at any of the advice at the moment, it seems to be very difficult to imagine how the transport infrastructure is going to be able to take more than a small proportion of the former volumes of traffic that there were. Which means that people are either going to have to stay at home, or they're going to have to travel by motor car or by active travel. Now, the positive bit is the active travel. A lot of the government is putting money into, and there's a lot of encouragement now for, more cycle lanes, trying to encourage people to walk and through quieter parts and so on. And I think that will be something of a lasting effect. It won't be a fully lasting effect, but we've noticed at various times in the past, I think, when there was the London bombings on the underground in the times afterwards, there was people didn't go on the underground so much, and there was an increase in walking and cycling, I think. But of course, people drift back after a while. They get used to it, and they go back their old ways, particularly probably when winter comes and cycling isn't such good fun. So I think there will be, an effect of this. Partly because it just gives people, they'll be forced to do something that may help encourage a habit, but it's also forcing local authorities and others to try and bring forward their thinking and their plans, and maybe using it as an opportunity. Now they realize that here is a time when they can probably switch the emphasis in some of their transport focus onto a more active modes of travel. Now that'll be a good thing. The problem is that, of course, there are people getting into their cars is not going to be a good thing. And I don't know how that's going to play out. I mean, clearly, at the moment, it's not really an issue because there isn't much congestion, because overall volumes are still low. But when it starts to come back, the pressure, I can imagine, especially towards the autumn, when schools go back fully, presumably in the autumn, and by that time, I imagine, most people will be back at work, then there'll be real pressure. And I wouldn't like to judge how that's going to be. But you make a very important point about people staying home, because in one sense, there are some good things of that, because it means we don't all have to travel as much. We don't have to use as much resource and energy and, have as many trains running if more of us can do more of our work at home. It's not entirely clear whether that's always good from an energy perspective, because it depends a bit on, whether you're now heating your home and your workplace is also getting heated, and you're saving on some of the journey costs. But the more profound thing is about this is not necessarily good for health. And one of the reasons that the physical activity thing is good for commuting is because that is a self-imposed routine of regular exercise. I don't really take much exercise. I do some small bits, but I don't do very much, except I cycle to work. And that's half an hour each way for me. And it means normally, not now, but normally I have therefore an hour of exercise every day, and it's enforced, it's part of my routine. And that's much better than, you know, my sometimes deciding I'm going to go to the gym or something. I never go to a gym as it happens. But, you know, people who have to make an active decision to go and play or to take exercise, that's kind of much less variable, it's much less regular. It's, you know, it can be good, of course, but it isn't a sort of population solution. Whereas something which is built in as part of your routine is, and that is definitely a benefit. So I think that there are likely to be, I mean, people will discover, I'm sure people are getting a bit less fit. I am now, I'm sure, because I don't do as much. I'm not getting my hour a day of cycling at the moment. And, you know, that is not a good thing. And I think there are also things to do with mental health, about, you know, we are social creatures. We like to be out meeting people and being active. All of that is good for our health, physical, mental, and so on. So it's not a long-term solution being in confinement of any kind. It's definitely not a long-term solution economically. You know, this would be disastrous. So we've got to find a way of breaking out of this. And in the short term, we have got to learn to live with COVID-19, you know, and it's going to be with us forever, essentially, and it's going to become probably a completely endemic disease that we'll all have it eventually. It's not a question of if, but when, I think. But the consequences are that we also now need to plan. One other positive message is, though, that I think the COVID-19 epidemic has shown us that it's important to be prepared. You know, the reason that we are struggling is because we've been trying to play catch up for months now. You know, we didn't have enough testing, we didn't have enough tracking, we didn't have enough protective equipment, and so on and so on and so on. If we'd had all of that, we could have probably avoided the initial peak in the first place, as broadly Korea did. And they were in a good position because they'd had 2 previous epidemics that they had to respond to and they found damaging. So they were prepared this time. We weren't. And I think, you know, a lot of economies are now realizing how damaging it can be when you have no choice but to close everything down. Now, the parallel is with climate change is that I think it'll put much more focus on realizing you need to pay attention to the science, to the threats, be more active, understand that it's not just about the economy is stupid today. There are other things that will come back to bite us if we don't act with more vision, more closer attention to the science, and being very prepared in all sorts of ways. And that does mean hard and tough things, actually, for climate change, because we have to be prepared to protect ourselves against the inevitability of the climate change that will occur anyway, and some will occur, whatever we do now. But the harder part is taking all those difficult decisions to make the changes to mitigate, which means we and everybody else in the world needs to play as much part they can in reducing those emissions. But now is the time to learn how important that is, because this is the sort of consequence you get when things go off the tracks in ways which you did not really expect. And, you know, you can imagine things very similar to this. What if vector-borne diseases suddenly hit southern Britain, you know, spreading in from parts of southern Europe we haven't been used to before? People would be terrified. They'd be, you know, they wouldn't go out. They'd change their behaviors. And there are lots of changes that could have quite big impacts as well. So I think another thing from this is, yeah, there are lots of ramifications and thoughts about what could be, how this lessons might be learned. And I think you point to a very important one about the unhealthiness of being at home, which I think it is unhealthy. It's not good for us physically or mentally. But there are also lessons about being prepared, and the things which we might, some parts of this are worth capitalizing on. And I think as long as we pick up those strands and don't lose the whole opportunity, then some good will come out of this nonetheless. And I hope part of that is being more prepared for other events, and that includes things related to climate change.
Thanks, Paul. Victoria, thanks for your question. I think it's incredibly topical. If I can add my 2 pence worth and some observations, perhaps at a slightly more macro level. Personally, I think we're at a very interesting crossroads, and I'm quite hopeful about what COVID-19 has done, if you can extract some good from this situation, is that it's forced us to do a couple of things. One, to recognize that the state is an important player in solving these societal-wide issues, and can be an important player and can invest in that. And that together, working with individuals can buy into a solution that delivers the results. And the third element of this, I think that we can be hopeful about, is that we're starting to listen again to data, what scientists and experts are telling us, which has been probably not the case over the last decade or so, and it's been a worrying trend for some time. Now, all of those things I think bode well for our response to climate change. You know, Paul's quite well set out that the state and the individual need to work in cohort to achieve these benefits. We all have to buy into it. My only residual worry is that the economic toll of COVID-19 is massive, both in the UK and globally. And how does the government respond now? Do we respond by saying, well, we just need to get the economy moving at whatever cost? Climate issues are no longer of import. We're just going to burn fossil fuels or whatever it takes to start to get the economy moving? Or are we going to take a more considered approach, which probably will require more investment and some real green investment by the state that will generate medium and longer term really positive impacts from climate changes and some of the ancillary health effects and behavioral effects that Paul's been talking about? Which path do we go down? And I think it might vary in different countries. I think in the UK and Europe, rightly, we're probably at the cutting edge of implementing climate change initiatives. ESG for UK and European companies is a really important matter now. I think North America is catching up, but is a little bit behind. And then if you think of some of the developing countries, well, how important is it going to be to them? I think in the UK we've got enough momentum already that we've got traction now to start to really implement some of these both lifestyle and investment changes that are necessary to generate the benefits. So if anything, I'd step back and I'd say COVID-19 has forced us into accelerating how we think about this, and in observing that we can actually collectively, between state, private sector and individuals, really deliver a positive impact and a positive solution. So I'll pause there. I see that we're running up to the 1 hour, and this is flown by. Victoria, did you want to have a final parting question at your option?
Thanks again. I suppose I'd just make one observation on what you've just said, Richard. I think that's a very interesting point about which direction is taken coming out of COVID. Is it to sort of effectively see climate change, ESG issues as something that can be traded as against the sort of the need to get the economy going? I mean, happily, as somebody who feels quite strongly about this area, I think the sense I get from the tone from regulators, I say this as a lawyer looking at across the piece, is that if anything, there does not seem to be a back step being taken in terms of driving the ESG agenda. We're seeing that very much from Europe and I think from the UK regulators looking at sort of financial services market, etc. So I would hope that isn't the way that things go. But equally, we've got not just COVID-19, but Brexit coming back onto the agenda, and the two things together with what has been a relatively unstable political situation in the UK over a number of years, I guess we may see that changing. But that's really just a parting observation, and thank you very much. It's been a really interesting presentation and discussion.
Victoria, thank you for your contribution. So to wrap up, then I think we've got some very good reasons for guarded optimism for the future. I think we're at an interesting juncture with COVID-19 and how society, the state and individuals continue to deliver on our targets and our commitments for greenhouse gas reductions. And there are, irrespective, I think, of what I've heard of how the rest of the world responds, our positive responses in this will have tangible beneficial impacts in the round on longevity across the UK. And that's really something to be pleased and hopeful about. That's very good news. Paul, I'll give you the last opportunity to wrap up, and then we'll conclude.
Thanks. I think you summarized it pretty well. There's not a lot for me to add. The message that I always like to convey, though, is really the one that you were making, that actually there are, our response to climate change, it does present huge challenges, but it's nearly all good. There are very few downsides of acting in ways which will lead us to a lower carbon economy, one which is more in tune with environmental sustainability. There will be benefits for health, benefits for quality of life, and so on. There are some negatives, but they are very small overall. And I think that is a genuine reason for optimism. This is perhaps the biggest opportunity for us to improve the quality of life and the health and well-being of our populations that we have had for many, many decades. If we are able to grasp them all, then we will all look back with some satisfaction of the gains that we have made. But it is going to be a difficult path, and things are going to interrupt that pathway all along. Economic downturns, COVID-19, all of these are going to be distractions that are going to slow our pace. But I am encouraged that there are now a much greater volume of interest and activity and commitment to making change for climate action, both in response to the protecting against the risk, but most importantly about the mitigation side. And I think that will have very positive but important and big influences on the way we orientate our economies.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for your excellent expert input to this roundtable. With that, we will close and wish you all to enjoy the rest of the Longevity Leaders Conference. Good day.